Today I'm going to talk about the cosmological argument. This is an argument for the existence of God. Now, whenever you write an essay about the cosmological argument, it's a good idea to give an introduction, and there are certain key ideas that must be stated in any essay. The first of these is that the cosmological argument is about the cosmos. Cosmos meaning universe. So the cosmological argument is attempting to demonstrate the existence of God from the existence of the cosmos, all the phenomena within the cosmos. What this means is that the cosmological argument is using empirical evidence, or attempting to do so, in order to demonstrate that there must be a God. But this empirical evidence means that it is an a posteriori argument. Now, we have learned the word a posteriori in our lessons. A posteriori meaning after sensory evidence. So sensory evidence leads us to conclude that there must be a creator or a God, a first cause. Now, philosophers such as Aquinas, who we're going to be studying, try deductive reasoning here. Deductive reasoning is something, again, that we have covered in our lessons, and so this is the idea that premises lead us to an indisputable conclusion, that if we agree with the premises and we can understand those premises correctly, then the conclusion will be something we can't deny. However, as we have talked about, this argument actually might be better treated as an inductive argument. An inductive argument, then, is one where the premises lead to a possible conclusion, but it's one of many possible conclusions. And so here, if we treat this as an inductive argument, we might find that we are in more agreement with it potentially. Now, this is also sometimes known as the first cause argument, and we'll talk a little bit more about this in a minute. The idea being that there must be a first cause to all things. Now, Aristotle, as we've heard before, was a significant influence of Thomas Aquinas, and Thomas Aquinas is the person that we're going to be talking about a lot later on. But it is important for us to understand where Aquinas' influences come from. Aristotle existed pre-Christianity, so when he presented this argument, it was not a Christian argument. He claimed that the universe needed a craftsman or a creator, something that begins all things. And he began by observing that in the universe there seems to be movement. Now, movement here he means as change, things like decay, death. These things are change. All things are constantly going through a process of change, and in order for them to do so, they depend upon there being a mover that brings about that change. Now, this leads us potentially to a bit of a chain. We can see a chain of events taking place where a movement is brought about by a mover, and in turn that mover changes and that change is brought about by a prior mover. Now, if we were to trace back that chain of events, we should be able to see, according to Aristotle, that there's a common source of all this change or movement. This is all empirical information. We can see this by observing the universe, observing the cosmos around us, and all this empirical data is sensory. It's made of matter. And so this matter must all come from some kind of common source or starting point. Now, if we're going to start talking about a starting point for all this change, then we come across an issue where that starting point cannot change or decay or move itself. So this must be some kind of first mover or prime mover, something that's not moved by other things. Because if it were moved by other things, it wouldn't be a first mover. It would just be another point in the big long chain. So Aristotle comes to this conclusion that there must be a prime mover. There must be something that starts off this chain of change or movement, but yet is unchanged or unmoved by any other thing. Now, for want of a better word, we're going to call this God. But this is not the God that we know from Christianity. It's not the God of classical theism. Because for Aristotle, God is not the sole creator of the universe. He doesn't sustain the universe and keep it going in a personal way like we see in Christianity. He's not a personal being who acts within the universe, and he's not got a personal interest in the universe. So God is not this personal being who we would be able to pray to, relate to, change in any way. However, since this God is a first mover and cannot be subject to the process of change, there are some qualities that he does share with the God of classical theism. For Aristotle, he must be transcendent. Transcendent means above and beyond the universe, outside of the universe, and therefore not subject to all the same things that the universe or cosmos is. So God for Aristotle is similar to the God of classical theism inasmuch as he is different from the universe and remains unaffected by it. Now, Thomas Aquinas loved Aristotle, as we know, and he felt that the empirical evidence that Aristotle gives us was very valuable. He liked his empiricism, his way of reasoning, and so he felt that he wanted to take on this approach. He claimed that the statement God exists is not self-evident, meaning it's not obvious to us that God exists. In actual fact, we've got to demonstrate it. And so Thomas Aquinas attempted to do this in a number of different ways. Now, it's important to note at this stage that Aristotle did not think that this would necessarily be able to prove the God of classical theism. And as we can see in this quote, he said, God's effects are enough to prove that God exists, even if they may not be enough to help us comprehend what he is. So in that sense, all Aquinas is doing here is demonstrating that God exists, not what God is like. God's nature is maybe something that can be debated later on. So, Thomas Aquinas, in his book Summa Theologica, talked about 5 ways, or demonstratio, and these relying primarily on empirical evidence to try and demonstrate the existence of God. Now, the first 3 are the ones that we are interested in here. The 4th and 5th are arguments that take on a different form and will be discussed another time. So if you're talking about 5 ways in an essay, you would focus on the first 3 of his 5 ways or demonstratio. So we are going to be looking at the unmoved mover, the uncaused causer, and possibility and necessity. These 3 ways make up the cosmological argument. So, Aquinas' first way. Now, this first way is known as the unmoved mover, unchanged changer, or prime mover, and is very clearly linked to what Aristotle had been arguing in the past. So he begins by pointing out that everything that is in motion, everything that changes, is moved or changed by something else. Now, this is based on basic observation of the cosmos. We know that this must be true because we can see it for ourselves. Aquinas used the example of fire and wood, because what we can notice is that all things in the process of change are in a state of being or actuality at this current time, but in the process of change move towards their potentiality, which is what they have the potential to become. So in the example of fire making wood hot, we can say that wood currently is cold, that is actuality, but it is caused or moved to become hot through the application of fire, which is hot itself. So that wood is in the motion to become what it's got the potential to be, and it is moved by another thing, something that already has that quality. Now, what Aquinas felt was that if we are to look at this chain of movement being moved by another thing, then potentially you've got the possibility of infinite regress, which is where the chain stretches back forever. Now, as far as Aquinas was concerned, infinite regress is impossible. It cannot go on forever. There has to be a point where this whole chain is moved or begun by something, and that's what begins this idea. So if there cannot be an infinite regress, there must therefore be a first mover or changer. There must be something that starts off the whole process. And he focuses here on these items that are in the process of changing or moving, that are moving from their state of actuality towards their potentiality and making a new actuality for themselves. That is where his attention lies. Now, the second way is quite similar. Many people will be tempted to just say the second way is the same but substitutes a different word, but that isn't quite accurate. It is important in an essay to be able to go through both the first way and the second way. We can break it down to have very similar wording, because we can say that he notices every effect has a cause. Now, we can identify that there are causes and effects in the universe. Nothing can be the cause of itself, because if it was, it would have to exist before it existed, and that's logical nonsense. So it's important to understand that everything that is an effect has been caused by something else, something outside of itself. Again, he denies infinite regress in this chain of cause and effect, cause and effect. There must be, therefore, a first causer, something that has caused all the chain of cause and effect, but is not part of that chain itself. It is the beginning. It is something that is uncaused. Now, this focuses more on the item or agent that does the acting, whereas the first way was focused on the idea of the thing that is being moved. All right? So if we think about an example of a football flying across a field, in the first way we were focused on the football and its process of change. Here in the second way, our attention is on the cause that brought about those changes in the football. For example, the foot that kicked it, or the hands that threw it. Now, Aquinas reflects that on the nature of the causes of these particular events. So, for example, each action has theoretically an infinite number of causes, and there's potential for an infinite number of results. It's not just a neat line of cause, effect, cause, effect, cause, effect. It would be better to view it as a kind of web, if you like, of causality that goes forward and backward in time and outwards in space. So it's not about how we can understand each individual cause and effect in a nice, neat line, but instead we have to understand the whole cosmos as existing as part of causality. Now, the third way is slightly different and is worth spending a bit of time over. There's new vocabulary here in particular that is very important for you to define. So this third way is known as possibility and necessity. Now, he begins from the point noticing that the world consists of contingent items. So we can notice that some contingent beings exist, and in fact the world or universe or cosmos consists of contingent things. Now, contingent things here can best be defined as items which are dependent on other things for their existence. Something that needs something else in order to exist. I'm contingent because I cannot exist without, for instance, oxygen, or the world to stand on, or my parents having brought me about. I'm dependent on other things. Also, a contingent being can not exist. It could be conceivable that the events did not take place that brought me about. And certainly there is a possibility, or a certainty if you like, that one day I won't be here anymore. So a contingent being will come into being having not existed before, and will go out of existence and not exist again. A contingent being is dependent and is, well, mortal, if you like, is temporary, finite. So we know that within the universe there are some contingent beings, and we can extend that to say that the universe consists of contingent beings. Now, what Aquinas then goes on to say is that if all beings were contingent, there must have been a time when there were no contingent items. So there would have been a time prior to contingent beings coming into existence. What he means by this is that since we've got contingent beings, all of which have to have had a start, and all of which must have had a time when they didn't exist, that if every single thing in the whole cosmos, the cosmos itself, was all contingent, there must have been a time when it didn't exist, when there was nothing, no contingent items. Now, if that was the case, and there's only the possibility of having contingent things, then contingent things could never have come into existence at all, because there would have been nothing to start the contingent item off. So all beings cannot be contingent. Instead, there must be a necessary being. Now here, a necessary being is a being that cannot not exist. A necessary being is a being that must exist, is infinite, has no beginning, has no end, is not dependent on anything else in order for its existence. And it's only through the existence of a necessary being that any contingent beings can begin at all. Because without that necessary being, there could never be a contingent being come into existence. So if there is a necessary being that exists, and remember we've defined this thing as an infinite, independent being that does not depend on anything else for its existence and exists for all eternity, cannot begin, cannot end, then we're talking about something that the best name to call it is God. Now remember, Aquinas is not saying that he can tell us what this God is like yet. It's not necessarily got to be the omnipotent, omnibenevolent, omniscient, personal being that we can pray to, although Aquinas did believe in that God. But through this argument we can demonstrate that there is a being that can best be described as God, that must exist if anything else is able to exist. Now this third way seems more ontological rather than cosmological. There's a kind of crossover really. An ontological argument is to do with the nature of being. And where we're using terms such as contingent and necessary, and we are not really using a posteriori evidence so much anymore, we're more using a priori evidence. Here, this is more of an ontological argument, but it still exists as part of the cosmological argument, and we use these three arguments together. So, we can say then that the universe consists of these contingent items, that if all beings were contingent, then there would have to be a time when there were none. If there were a time when there were no contingent beings, then nothing could come into existence, because all contingent beings are dependent on others for their own existence. Therefore, there must be some kind of necessary being which is independent, cannot not exist, is uncaused and eternal. And for want of a better word, we're going to call that God.